Leningrad is encircled. The last road is cut. The German calculation is simple. Without supply, any city capitulates. But then something appears absurd. In winter, supply convoys run across a frozen lake under bombs, artillery, and darkness. Not enough to live normally, just enough not to die. And that proves sufficient for the city to hold for 872 days. 3 million people endured starvation, artillery bombardment, and temperatures plunging toward -40 degrees Celsius. German forces expected surrender within weeks. Soviet defenders held every building, every street, every block. A supply route across frozen Lake Ladoga, vulnerable to German observation and attack but never fully cut, kept the city alive when conventional logistics had failed. This is how Leningrad survived 872 days of siege. Why could German intelligence, despite controlling all land approaches and conducting aerial reconnaissance, not stop the lifeline that sustained Soviet resistance? September 1941. German Army Group North reached Leningrad's outskirts. The city appeared doomed. German forces reached Leningrad's southern approaches in early September 1941. Army Group North had advanced through the Baltic states and was positioned to capture the Soviet Union's second-largest city. Finnish forces to the north helped seal the encirclement ring. By September 8th, German forces had cut the last land route into Leningrad. The city was surrounded. The situation inside Leningrad was catastrophic. The city's peacetime population exceeded 3 million. Over 2.5 million civilians remained trapped when the encirclement completed. Food stockpiles were insufficient for a prolonged siege. The city's warehouses contained perhaps 2 months of supplies at normal consumption rates. Industrial facilities required fuel and raw materials to continue operating. German operational planning assumed Leningrad would surrender or collapse rapidly. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized that cities cut off from supply would capitulate when food ran out. German forces positioned artillery to bombard the city systematically while maintaining the encirclement. The plan was starvation, and terror would accomplish what direct assault might cost in casualties. The physical geography appeared to guarantee German success. All land routes into Leningrad passed through German-controlled territory. Air supply was insufficient for a city of millions. The logic seemed inescapable. Without supply, Leningrad would fall. The Soviet defensive position in September 1941 was desperate, but not hopeless. The city's factories still functioned, and the population could be mobilized for defense. The Baltic Fleet remained in Leningrad's harbor. Most critically, Lake Ladoga, though partially controlled by German forces on its southern shore, offered a potential supply route if it could be secured and exploited. Soviet planning for Leningrad's survival began immediately after encirclement. Lake Ladoga represented the only viable connection to Soviet-controlled territory. The lake's western shore was held by Soviet forces. The eastern shore was beyond German reach. A water route across the lake could connect Leningrad to the mainland Soviet rail network. The water route across Lake Ladoga became operational in limited form by late September 1941. Small vessels and barges transported supplies from the eastern shore to Leningrad's northwestern districts. The capacity was inadequate for the city's needs, but it established that supply was possible despite encirclement. German forces attempted to interdict the water route through air attacks and artillery fire, but could not completely stop the traffic. The challenge was winter. Lake Ladoga freezes from November through April. Ice conditions on the lake are variable. Soviet planners recognized that an ice road across the lake could provide supply capacity far exceeding what boats could deliver. The question was whether the ice would be thick enough and whether the route could be maintained under German observation and attack. Ice road construction began in late November 1941 as lake temperatures dropped. Soviet engineers surveyed ice thickness across potential routes. The ice road, eventually called the Road of Life, followed a path across the lake that balanced the shortest distance with the most stable ice conditions. The route extended approximately 30 kilometers across the frozen lake surface. The Road of Life became operational in late November 1941. Initial traffic was limited as ice thickness was marginal for heavy vehicles. Horse-drawn sleds transported supplies while ice strengthened. By December, truck convoys were running. By January 1942, the route was handling thousands of tons of supplies weekly. The capacity still fell short of the city's peacetime consumption, but it provided enough to prevent complete collapse. The operation of the ice road required systematic organization. Soviet forces established way stations along the route where drivers could rest and vehicles could be serviced. Ice thickness was monitored continuously. Routes were adjusted as ice conditions changed. The road operated primarily at night to reduce vulnerability to German air attack. Supply priorities were brutal. Food for the population came first, though rations remained minimal. Ammunition for defenders was essential. Fuel for the city's power plants and industrial facilities was critical. Evacuations of civilians, particularly children, occurred on return trips when vehicles had capacity. The ice road was visible to German aerial reconnaissance. Vehicles moving across the frozen lake could be observed. German intelligence knew the route existed and understood its significance. Soviet procedures did not aim to conceal the route's existence. Instead, the focus was protecting its operation, with dispersed storage on both shores, night movements when possible, and defensive measures against interdiction attempts. The supply artery was the Road of Life. German attacks to destroy the ice road included aerial bombardment and artillery fire. The Luftwaffe targeted concentrations of vehicles and storage facilities. Artillery from German positions on the southern shore could engage sections of the ice road. Soviet responses included anti-aircraft defenses, fighter patrols, and dispersal of traffic. Damaged sections were repaired rapidly. German reconnaissance of Leningrad and Lake Ladoga continued throughout the siege. The Luftwaffe conducted aerial photography. Ground observers on the shore monitored lake activity. Intelligence officers analyzed the observations to assess Soviet supply operations and the city's viability. Analysts tried to calculate the ice road's capacity. Aerial photographs showed vehicle tracks across the frozen lake. The difficult question was whether the observed tonnage was sufficient to sustain the city. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed cities would collapse when supply fell below subsistence levels. The question remained whether the Road of Life provided enough capacity to prevent that collapse. The assessment challenge was understanding the margins. German planning assumptions about minimum supply requirements for city survival were based on peacetime consumption rates and normal siege conditions. Leningrad operated far below those levels. Soviet defenders and civilians endured conditions that Wehrmacht doctrine assumed would force surrender. German operational doctrine expected that interdiction of the ice road combined with artillery bombardment of the city would create conditions forcing capitulation. The attacks damaged the route and reduced its capacity, but they never stopped it completely. Soviet repairs, route adjustments, and defensive measures maintained operation despite losses. German intelligence observed this resilience, but underestimated Soviet ability to sustain operations at the minimal levels that proved sufficient. The siege of Leningrad lasted from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, lasting 872 days. The population endured artillery bombardment, starvation, and extreme cold. Over 1 million civilians died, primarily from hunger and cold during the first winter, though estimates vary by source. The first winter was catastrophic. Food rations reached their lowest point in November and December 1941 and in January 1942. Deaths from starvation peaked during these months. Temperatures plunged toward -40 degrees Celsius. Heating fuel was scarce. Water systems froze. The city's infrastructure was collapsing. Soviet defenders held their positions despite conditions that would have broken less determined forces. Military units defending the perimeter received marginally better rations than civilians, but still operated under extreme deprivation. Defensive lines held. The ring around Leningrad remained unbroken. The road of life sustained a minimal flow of supplies through the winter. As the ice strengthened, capacity increased. Evacuations of civilians occurred on return trips. By spring 1942, hundreds of thousands had been evacuated. The water route resumed operation once the lake was navigable. Subsequent winters followed similar patterns. Each year, the ice road operated with improved organization. Anti-aircraft defenses strengthened. German interdiction efforts continued, but became less effective as Soviet procedures adapted. Soviet breakthrough operations in January 1943 created a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. This corridor, though under German artillery fire, allowed a rail connection to be established. Supply capacity increased significantly. The ice road remained important, but it was supplemented by rail traffic. Final liberation came in January 1944. Soviet offensive operations drove German forces away from Leningrad's approaches. On January 27, 1944, Soviet forces declared the siege lifted. The city that German forces had expected to fall in weeks had survived 872 days. The siege failed because Soviet determination, combined with minimal supply across the road of life, proved sufficient when German doctrine assumed it would not be. The Wehrmacht expected that cutting land routes and interdicting lake traffic would force surrender through starvation. Instead, defenders and civilians endured conditions beyond what German planners assumed humans could sustain. The road of life was vulnerable to observation and attack, but it never completely stopped. Tonnage delivered was far below peacetime consumption, yet enough to keep defenders armed, factories minimally operational, and enough people alive to maintain essential services. The margin was brutal, and over 1 million people died, but the city continued to function. German intelligence observed the ice road for the duration. They attacked it, tried to calculate its capacity, and assessed whether it provided sufficient supply. What German doctrine underestimated was Soviet willingness to survive on margins that seemed mathematically insufficient. The city operated on starvation rations, endured extreme cold, and absorbed massive casualties while continuing to resist. In September 1941, German forces encircled Leningrad. Wehrmacht intelligence assessed the city would fall within weeks once starvation set in. All land routes were cut. For 872 days, the siege continued. More than 1 million civilians died. The city never surrendered. A supply route across frozen Lake Ladoga, operating under German observation and attack, provided a minimal flow of supplies that sustained resistance. The siege failed because Soviet determination to hold Leningrad, combined with the road of life, proved sufficient when German doctrine assumed it would not. The city endured conditions that planning assumptions said would force collapse. Not enough to live normally, just enough not to die. And that proved enough. That was the siege of Leningrad, the city that survived 872 days on the absolute minimum.